Hello and welcome back to Baby Alice's Stories. We now return to Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 8. Betsy starts a sewing society. Betsy and Molly had taken Deborah to school with them. Deborah was the old wooden doll with brown painted curls. She had lain in a trunk almost ever since Aunt Abigail's childhood, because Cousin Ann had never cared for dolls when she was a little girl. At first, Betsy had not dared to ask to see her, much less to play with her. But when Ellen, as she had promised, came over to Putney Farm that first Saturday, she had said right out as soon as she landed in the house, "Oh, Mrs. Putney, can't we play with Deborah?" And Aunt Abigail had answered, "Why, yes, of course. I knew there was something I've kept forgetting." She went up with them herself to the cold attic and opened the little hair trunk under the eaves. There lay a doll, flat on her back, looking up at them brightly out of her blue eyes. "Well, Debbie dear," said Aunt Abigail, taking her up gently, "it's a good long time since you and I played under the lilac bushes, isn't it? I expect you've been pretty lonesome up here all these years. Never you mind, you'll have some good times again now." She pulled down the doll's full ruffled skirt, straightened the lace at the neck of her dress, and held her for a moment, looking down at her silently. You could tell by the way she spoke, by the way she touched Deborah, by the way she looked at her, that she had loved the doll very dearly, and maybe still did a little. When she put Deborah into Betsy's arms, the child felt that she was receiving something very precious, almost something alive. She and Ellen looked with delight at the yards and yards of picote-edged ribbons sewed on by hand to the ruffles of the skirt, and lifted up the silk folds to admire the carefully made full petticoats and frilly drawers, the pretty, soft old kid shoes and white stockings. Aunt Abigail looked at them with an absent smile on her lips, as though she were living over old scenes. Finally, "It's too cold to play up here," she said, coming to herself with a long breath. "You better bring Deborah and the trunk down into the south room." She carried the doll, and Betsy and Ellen each took an end of the old trunk, no larger than a modern suitcase. They settled themselves on the big couch back at the table with the lamp. Old Shep was on it, but Betsy coaxed him off by putting down some bones Cousin Ann had been saving for him. When he finished those and came back for the rest of his snooze, he found his place occupied by the little girls, sitting cross-legged, examining the contents of the trunk, all spread out around them. Shep sighed deeply and sat down with his nose resting on the couch near Betsy's knee, following all their movements with his kind, dark eyes. Once in a while, Betsy stopped hugging Deborah or exclaiming over a new dress long enough to pat Shep's head and fondle his ears. This was what he was waiting for, and every time she did it, he wagged his tail thumpingly against the floor. After that, Deborah and her trunk were kept downstairs where Betsy could play with her, and often she was taken to school. You never heard of such a thing as taking a doll to school, did you? Well, I told you this was a queer, old-fashioned school that any modern school superintendent would sniff at. As a matter of fact, it was not only Betsy who took her doll to school. All the little girls did, whenever they felt like it. Miss Benton, the teacher, had a shelf for them in the entryway where the wraps were hung, and the dolls sat on it and waited patiently all through lessons. At recess time or nooning, each little mother snatched her own child and began to play. As soon as it grew warm enough to play outdoors without just racing around every minute to keep from freezing to death, the dolls and their mothers went out to a great pile of rocks at one end of the bare, stony field which was the playground. There they sat and played in the spring sunshine, warmer from day to day. There were a great many holes and shelves and pockets and little caves in the rocks, which made lovely places for playing keep house. Each little girl had her own particular cubbyholes and rooms, and they visited their dolls back and forth all around the pile. And as they played, they talked very fast about all sorts of things, being little girls and not boys who just yelled and howled inarticulately as they played ball or duck on a rock or prisoner's goal, racing and running and wrestling noisily all around the rocks. There was one child who neither played with the girls nor ran and whooped with the boys. This was little 6-year-old Lias, one of the 2 boys in Molly's first grade. At recess time, he generally hung about the school door by himself, looking moodily down and knocking the toe off his ragged, muddy shoe against the stone. The little girls were talking about him one day as they played. "My, isn't that Lias Brewster, the horridest looking child?" said Eliza, who had the 2nd grade all to herself, although Molly now read out of the 2nd reader with her. "Mercy, yes, so ragged," said Anastasia Monahan, called Stacy for short. She was a big girl, 14 years old, who was in the 7th grade. "He doesn't look as if he ever combed his hair," said Betsy. "It looks just like a wisp of old hay." "And sometimes," little Molly proudly added her bit to the talk of the older girls, "he forgets to put on any stockings and just has his dreadful old shoes on over his dirty bare feet." "I guess he hasn't got any stockings half the time," said Big Stacy scornfully. "I guess his stepfather drinks him up." "How can he drink up stockings?" asked Molly, opening her round eyes very wide. "Shh, you mustn't ask. Little girls shouldn't know about such things, should they, Betsy?" "No, indeed," said Betsy, looking mysterious. As a matter of fact, she herself had no idea what Stacy meant, but she looked wise and said nothing. Some of the boys had squatted down near the rocks for a game of marbles now. "Well, anyhow," said Molly resentfully, "I don't care what his stepfather does to his stockings. I wish Lias would wear him to school, and lots of times he hasn't anything on under those horrid old overalls either. I can see his bare skin through the torn places." "I wish he didn't have to sit so near me," said Betsy complainingly. "He's so dirty." "Well, I don't want him near me either," cried all the other little girls at once. Ralph glanced up at them frowning. From where he knelt with his middle finger crooked behind a marble, ready for a shot, he looked as he always did, very rough and half threatening. "Oh, you girls make me sick," he said. He sent his marble straight to the mark. pocketed his opponents, and stood up, scowling at the little mothers. I guess if you had to live the way he does, you'd be dirty. Half the time he don't get anything to eat before he comes to school, and if my mother didn't put up some extra for him in my box, he wouldn't get any lunch either. And then you go and jump on him. Why doesn't his own mother put up his lunch? Betsy challenged their critic. He hasn't got any mother. She's dead, said Ralph, turning away with his hands in his pockets. He yelled to the boys, "Come on, fellas. Betch to the bridge and back. Beat you to the bridge and back," and was off, with the others racing at his heels. "Well, anyhow, I don't care. He is dirty and horrid," said Stacy emphatically, looking over at the drooping, battered little figure leaning against the school door, listlessly kicking at a stone. But Betsy did not say anything more just then. The teacher who boarded round was staying at Putney Farm at that time, and that evening, as they all sat around the lamp in the south room, Betsy looked up from her game of checkers with Uncle Henry and asked, "How can anybody drink up stockings?" "Mercy, child, what are you talking about?" asked Aunt Abigail. Betsy repeated what Anastasia Monahan had said, and was flattered by the instant, rather startled attention given her by the grown-ups. "Why, I didn't know that Bud Walker had taken to drinking again," said Uncle Henry. "My, that's too bad." "Who takes care of that child anyhow, now that poor Susie is dead?" Aunt Abigail asked of everybody in general. "Is he just living there alone with that good-for-nothing stepfather? How do they get enough to eat?" said Cousin Nan, looking troubled. Apparently, Betsy's question had brought something half forgotten and altogether neglected into their minds. They talked for some time after that about Lias, the teacher confirming what Betsy and Stacy had said. "And we sitting right here with plenty to eat and never raising a hand," cried Aunt Abigail. "How you will let things slip out of your mind," said Cousin Ann remorsefully. It struck Betsy vividly that Lias was not at all the one they blamed for his projectionable appearance. She felt quite ashamed to go on with the other things she and the little girls had said, and felt silent, pretending to be very much absorbed in her game of checkers. "Do you know," said Aunt Abigail suddenly, as though an inspiration had just struck her, "I wouldn't be a bit surprised if that Elmore Pond might adopt Lias if he was gone at the right way." If he was gone at the right way. "Who's Elmore Pond?" asked the school teacher. "Why, you must have seen him, that great big, red-faced, good-natured looking man that comes through here twice a year buying stock. He lives over Digby way, but his wife was a Hillsboro girl, Maidie Pelham, an awfully nice girl she was too. They never had any children, and Maidie told me the last time she was back for a visit that she and her husband talked quite often about adopting a little boy. Seems that Mr. Pond has always wanted a little boy. He's such a nice man. 'Twould be a lovely home for a child." "But goodness," said the teacher, nobody would want to adopt such an awful-looking ragamuffin as that Lias. He looks so meechin' too. I guess his stepfather is real mean to him when he's been drinking, and it's got Lias so he hardly dares hold his head up." The clock struck loudly. "Well, hear that," said Cousin Nan. 9 o'clock and the children not in bed. Molly's most asleep this minute. Trot along with you, Betsy. Trot along, Molly. And Betsy, be sure Molly's nightgown is buttoned up all the way." So it happened that, although the grown-ups were evidently going on to talk about Lias Brewster, Betsy heard no more of what they said. She herself went on thinking about Lias while she was undressing and answering absently little Molly's chatter. She was thinking about him even after they had gone to bed and put the light out, and were lying snuggled up to each other, back to front, their 4 legs crooked at the same angle, fitting in together neatly like 2 spoons in a drawer. She was thinking about him when she woke up, and as soon as she could get a hold of Cousin Ann, she poured out a new plan. She had never been afraid of Cousin Ann since the evening Molly had fallen into the wolf pit, and Betsy had seen that pleased smile on Cousin Ann's firm lips. "Cousin Ann, couldn't we girls at school get together and sew? You'd have to help us some, and make some nice new clothes for little Lias Brewster, and fix him up so he'll look better, and maybe that Mr. Pond will like him and adopt him." Cousin Ann listened attentively and nodded her head. "Yes, I think that would be a good idea," she said. "We were thinking last night we ought to do something for him. If you'll make the clothes, Mother'll knit him some stockings, and Father will get him some shoes. Mr. Pond never makes his spring trip till late May, so we'll have plenty of time." Betsy was full of importance that day at school, and at recess time got the girls together on the rocks and told them all about the plan. "Cousin Ann says she'll help us, and we can meet at our house every Saturday afternoon till we get them done. It'll be fun. Aunt Abigail telephoned down to the store right away, and Mr. Wilkins says he'll give the cloth and we'll make it up." Betsy spoke very grandly of making it up, although she had hardly held a needle in her life. And when the Saturday afternoon meetings began, she was ashamed to see how much better Ellen and even Eliza could sew than she. To keep her end up, she was driven to practicing her stitches around the lamp in the evenings, with Aunt Abigail keeping an eye on her. Cousin Ann supervised the sewing on Saturday afternoons and taught those of the little girls whose legs were long enough how to use the sewing machine. First, they made a little pair of trousers out of an old gray woolen skirt of Aunt Abigail's. This was for practice, before they cut into the piece of new blue serge that the storekeeper had set up. Cousin Ann showed them how to pin the pattern on the goods, and they each cut out one piece. Those flat, queer-shaped pieces of cloth certainly did look less like a pair of trousers to Betsy than anything she had ever seen. Then one of the girls read aloud very slowly the mysterious-sounding directions from the wrapper of the pattern about how to put the pieces together. Cousin Ann helped here a little, particularly just as they were about to put the sections together wrong side up. Stacy, as the oldest, did the first basting, putting the notches together carefully, just as they read the instructions aloud. And there, all of a sudden, was a rough little sketch of a pair of knee trousers, without any hem or any waistband, of course, but just the 2-legged, complicated shape they ought to be. It was like a miracle to Betsy. Then Cousin Ann helped them sew the seams on the machine. They all turned to for the basting of the facings and the furnishing. They each made one buttonhole. It was the first one Betsy had ever made, and when she got through, she was as tired as though she had run all the way to school and back. Tired, but very proud. Although when Cousin Ann inspected that buttonhole, she covered her face with her handkerchief for a minute as though she were going to sneeze, although she didn't sneeze at all. It took them 2 Saturdays to finish up that trial pair of trousers, and when they showed the result to Aunt Abigail, she was delighted. "Well, to think of that being my old skirt," she said, putting on her spectacles to examine the work. She did not laugh either when she saw those buttonholes, but she got up hastily and went into the next room, where they soon heard her coughing. Then they made a little blouse out of some new blue gingham. Cousin Ann happened to have enough left over from a dress she was making. This thin material was ever so much easier to manage than the gray flannel, and they had the little garment done in no time, even to the buttons and buttonholes. Cousin Ann, when it came to making buttonholes, Cousin Ann sat right down with each one and supervised every stitch. You may not be surprised to know that they were a great improvement over the first batch. Then, making a great ceremony of it, they began on the store material, working twice a week now, because May was slipping along very fast, and Mr. Pond might be there at any time. They knew pretty well how to go ahead on this one after the experience of their first pair, and Cousin Ann was not much needed except as advisor in hard places. She sat there in the room with them, doing some sewing of her own, so quiet that half the time they forgot she was there. They forgot she was here. It was great fun sewing all together and chattering as they sewed. A good deal of the time they talked about how splendid it was of them to be so kind to little Lias. "My, I don't believe most girls would put themselves out this way for a dirty little boy," said Stacy complacently. "No, indeed," chimed in Betsy. "It's just like a story, isn't it? Working and sacrificing for the poor." "I guess he'll thank us all right for sure," said Ellen. "He'll never forget us as long as he lives, I don't suppose." Betsy, her imagination fired by this suggestion, said, "I guess when he's grown up, he'll be telling everybody about how, when he was so poor and ragged, Stacy Monahan and Ellen Peters and Elizabeth Ann and Eliza, put in that little girl hastily, very much afraid she would not be given her due share of the glory. Cousin Ann sewed and listened and said nothing. Toward the end of May, 2 little blouses, 2 pairs of trousers, 2 pairs of stockings, 2 sets of underwear, contributed by the teacher, and the pair of shoes Uncle Henry gave were ready. The little girls handled the pile of new garments with inexpressible pride, and debated just which way of bestowing them was sufficiently grand to be worthy the occasion. Betsy was for taking them to school and giving them to Lias one by one, so that each child could have her thanks separately. But Stacy wanted to take them to the house when Lias's stepfather would be there and shame him by showing that little girls had to do with what he ought to have done. Cousin Ann broke into the discussion by asking in her quiet, firm voice, "Why do you want Lias to know where the clothes came from? Why do you want Lias to know where the clothes come from?" They had forgotten again that she was there, and turned around quickly to stare at her. Nobody could think of any answer to her very queer question. It had not occurred to anyone that there could be such a question. Cousin Ann shifted her ground and asked another, "Why did you make these clothes anyhow?" They stared again, speechless. Why did she ask that? She knew why. Finally, little Molly said in her honest baby way, "Why, you know why, Miss Ann. So Lias Brewster will look nice, and Mr. Pond will maybe adopt him." Well, said Cousin Ann, what has that got to do with Lias knowing who did it? Why, he wouldn't know who to be grateful to, cried Betsy. Oh, said Cousin Ann. Oh, I see. You didn't do it to help Lias. You did it to have him grateful to you. I see. Molly is such a little girl, it's no wonder she didn't really take in what you girls were up to. She nodded her head wisely, as though now she understood. But if she did, little Molly certainly did not. She had not the least idea what everybody was talking about. She looked from one sober, downcast face to another rather anxiously. What was the matter? Apparently nothing was really the matter, she decided, for after a minute's silence, Miss Ann got up with entirely her usual face of cheerful gravity and said, Don't you think you little girls ought to top off this last afternoon with a tea party? There's a new batch of cookies, and you can make yourself some lemonade if you want to. They had these refreshments out on the porch in the sunshine, with their dolls for guests, and a great deal of chatter for sauce. Nobody said another word about how to give the clothes to Lias, till just as the girls were going away, Betsy said, walking along with the two older ones, Say, don't you think it'd be fun to go some evening after dark and leave the clothes on Lias's doorstep and knock and run away quick before anybody comes to the door? She spoke in an uncertain voice and smothered Deborah's carved wooden curls. Yes, I do, said Ellen, not looking at Betsy, but down at the weeds by the road. I think it would be lots of fun. Little Molly, playing with Annie and Eliza, did not hear this, but she was allowed to go with the older girls on the great expedition. It was a warm, dark evening in late May, with the frogs piping their sweet high note, and the first of the fireflies wheeling over the wet meadows near the tumble-down house where Lias lived. The girls took turns in carrying the big paper-wrapped bundle and stole along in the shadow of the trees, full of excitement, looking over their shoulders at nothing and pressing their hands over their mouths to keep back the giggles. There was, of course, no reason on earth why they should giggle, which is, of course, the very reason why they did. If you've ever been a little girl, you know about that. One window of the small house was dimly lighted. They found when they came inside of it, and they thrilled with excitement and joyful alarm. Suppose Lias's dreadful stepfather should come out and yell at them. They came forward on tiptoe, making a great deal of noise by stepping on twigs, rustling bushes, crackling gravel under their feet, and doing all the other things that make such a noise at night and never do in the daytime. But nobody stirred inside the room with the lighted window. They crept forward and peeping cautiously inside and stopped giggling. The dim light, coming from a little kerosene lamp with a smoky chimney, fell on a dismal, cluttered room. A bare, greasy window, a bare, greasy wooden table, and two broken back chairs, with little Lias in one of them. He had fallen asleep with his head on his arms, his pinched, dirty, sad little figure showing in the light from the lamp. His feet dangled high above the floor in their broken, muddy shoes. One sleeve was torn to the shoulder, and a piece of dry bread had slipped from his bony little hand, and a tin dipper stood beside him on the bare table. Nobody else was in the room, nor evidently in the darkened, empty, fireless house. As long as she lives, Betsy will never forget what she saw that night through that window. Her eyes grew very hot, and her hands very cold. Her heart thumped hard. She reached for little Molly and gave her a great hug in the darkness. Suppose it were little Molly asleep there, all alone in the dirty, dismal house, with no supper and nobody to put her to bed. She found that Ellen, next her, was crying quietly in the corner of her apron. Nobody said a word. Stacy, who had the bundle, walked around soberly to the front door, put it down, and knocked loudly. They all darted away noiselessly to the road, to the shadow of the trees, and waited until the door opened. A square of yellow light appeared, with Lias's figure very small at the bottom of it. They saw him stoop and pick up the bundle and go back into the house. They went quickly and silently back, separating at the crossroads with no good night greetings. Molly and Betsy began to climb the hill to Putney Farm. It was a very warm night for May, and little Molly began to puff for breath. "Let's sit down on this rock a while and rest," she said. They were halfway up the hill now. From the rock they could see the lights in the farmhouses scattered along the valley road and on the side of the mountain opposite them, like big stars falling from the multitude above. Betsy lay down on the rock and looked up at the stars. After a silence, little Molly's chirping voice said, "Oh, I thought you said we were going to march up to Lias in school and give him his clothes. Did you forget about that?" Betsy gave a wriggle of shame as she remembered that plan. "No, we didn't forget it," she said. "We thought this would be a better way." But how will Elias know who to thank?" asked Molly. "That's no matter," said Betsy. "Yes, it was Elizabeth Ann that was who said that. And meant it too. She was not even thinking of what she was saying. Between her and the stars, thick over her in the black, soft sky, she saw again that dirty, disordered room and the little boy, all alone, asleep, with a piece of dry bread in his bony little fingers. She looked hard and long at that picture, all the time seeing the quiet stars through it, and then she turned over and hid her face on the rock. She had said her "Now I lay me" every night since she could remember, but she had never prayed till she lay there with her face on the rock, saying over and over, "Oh God, please, 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 make Mr. Pond adopt Lias." Chapter 9. The New Clothes Fail. All the little girls went early to school the next day, eager for the first glimpse of Lias in his new clothes. They now quite enjoyed the mystery about who had made them, and were full of agreeable excitement as the little figure was seen approaching down the road. He wore the gray trousers and the little blue shirt. The trousers were a little too long, the shirt a perfect fit. The girls gazed at him with pride as he came on the playground, walking briskly along in the new shoes, which were just the right size. He had been wearing all winter a pair of cast-off women's shoes. From a distance, he looked like another child, but as he came closer, oh, his face, his hair, his hands, his fingernails. The little fellow had evidently tried to live up to his beautiful new raiment, for his hair had been roughly put back from his face, and around his mouth and nose was a small area of almost clean skin, where he had made an attempt at washing his face. But he had made practically no impression on the layers of encrusted dirt, and the little girls looked at him ruefully. Mr. Pond would certainly never take a fancy to such a dreadfully grimy child. His new clean clothes made him look all the worse, as though dirty on purpose. The little girls retired to their rock pile and talked over their bitter disappointment. Ralph and the other boys absorbed in a game of marbles near them. Lias had gone proudly into the schoolroom to show himself to Miss Benton. It was the day before Decoration Day, and a good deal of time was taken up with practicing on the recitations they were going to give at the Decoration Day exercises in the village. Several of the children from each school in the township were to speak pieces in the town hall. Betsy was to recite Barbara Fritzsche, her first love in that school, but she droned it over with none of her usual pleasure, her eyes on little Lias's smiling face, so unconscious of its dinginess. At noontime, the boys disappeared down toward the swimming hole. They often took a swim at noon, and nobody thought anything about it on that day. The little girls ate their lunch on their rock, mourning over the failure of their plans and scheming ways to meet the new obstacle. Stacy suggested, "Couldn't your Aunt Abigail invite him up to your house for supper and then give him a bath afterward?" But Betsy, although she had never heard of treating a supper guest in this way, was sure that it was not possible. She shook her head sadly, her eyes on the far-off gleam of white where the boys jumped up and down in their swimming hole. That was not a good name for it, because there was only one part of it deep enough to swim in. Mostly it was a shallow bay in an arm of the river where the water was only up to a little boy's knees and where there was almost no current. The sun beating down on it made it quite warm, and even the first graders' mothers allowed them to go in. They only jumped up and down and squealed and splashed each other, but they enjoyed that quite as much as Frank and Harry, the two seventh graders, enjoyed their swooping dives from the springboard over the pool. They were late in getting back from the river that day, and Miss Benton had to ring her bell hard in that direction before they came trooping up and clattered into the schoolroom, where the girls already sat, their eyes lowered virtuously to their books, with a prim air of self-righteousness. They were never late. Betsy was reciting her arithmetic. She was getting on famously with that. Weeks ago, as soon as Miss Benton had seen the confusion of the little girl's mind, the two had settled down to a serious struggle with that subject. Miss Benton had Betsy recite all by herself, so she wouldn't be flurried by the others, and to begin with had gone back to bedrock, to things Betsy absolutely knew. To the 2 times 2s and the 3 times 3s. And then, very cautiously, a step at a time, they had advanced, stopping short whenever Betsy felt a beginning of that bewildered, guessing impulse which made her answer wildly at random. After a while in the dark night, which arithmetic had always been to her, Betsy began to make out a few definite outlines, which were always there. Facts which she knew to be so without guessing from the expression of her teacher's face. From that moment her progress had been rapid, one sure fact hooking itself on to another, and another one on to that. She attacked the page of problems now with a zest and self-confidence, which made her arithmetic lessons among the most interesting hours at school. On that day, she was standing up at the board, a piece of chalk in her hand, chewing her tongue and thinking hard how to find out the amount of wallpaper needed for a room 12 feet square with 2 doors and 2 windows in it, when her eye fell on little Lias, bent over his reading book. She forgot her arithmetic. She forgot where she was. She stared and stared, till Ellen, catching the direction of her eyes, looked and stared too. Little Elias was clean, preternaturally, almost wetly clean. His face was clean and shining. His ears shone pink and fair. His hands were absolutely spotless. Even his hay-colored hair was clean and still damp, brushed flatly back till it shone in the sun. Betsy blinked her eyes a great many times, thinking she must be dreaming. But every time she opened them, there was Elias, looking white and polished like a new willow whistle. Somebody poked her hard in the ribs. She started and turning saw Ralph, who was doing a sum beside her on the board, scowling at her under his black brows. "Quit gawking at Elias," he said under his breath. "You make me tired." Something conscious and shamefaced in his manner made Betsy understand at once what had happened. Ralph had taken Elias down to the little boy's waiting place and had washed him all over. She remembered now that they had a piece of yellow soap there. Her face broke into a radiant smile, and she began to say something to Ralph about how nice that was of him, but he frowned again and said crossly, "Oh, cut it out. Look at what you've done there. If I couldn't 9 times 8 and get it right." How queer boys are, thought Betsy, erasing her mistake and putting down the right answer. But she did not try to speak to Ralph again about Elias, not even after school, when she saw Elias going home with a new cap on his head, which she recognized as Ralph's. She just looked at Ralph's bare head and smiled her eyes at him, keeping the rest of her face sober, the way Cousin Ann did. For just a minute, Ralph almost smiled back. At least he looked quite friendly. They stepped along toward home together, the first time Ralph had ever condescended to walk beside a girl. "We got a new colt," he said. "Have you?" she said. "What color?" "Black, with a white star, and they're going to let me ride him when he's old enough." "My, won't that be nice?" said Betsy. And all this time they were both thinking of little Elias with his new clothes and his sweet, thin face shining with cleanliness. "Do you like spruce gum?" asked Ralph. "Oh, I love gum," said Betsy. "Well, I'll bring you down a chunk tomorrow if I don't forget it," said Ralph, turning off at the crossroads. They had not mentioned Elias at all. The next day, they were to have school only in the morning. In the afternoon, they were to go in a big hay wagon down to the village to the exercises. Elias came to school in his new blue serge trousers and his white blouse. The little girls gloated over his appearance and hung around him, for who was to visit school that morning but Mr. Pond himself? Cousin Ann had arranged it somehow. It took Cousin Ann to fix things. During recess, as they were playing, still Pond no more moving on the playground, Mr. Pond and Uncle Henry drew up to the edge of the playground, stopped their horse, and talking and laughing together, watched the children at play. Betsy looked hard at the big, burly, kind-faced man with the smiling eyes and a hearty laugh, and decided that he would do perfectly for Elias. But what she decided was to have little importance, apparently, for after all he would not get out of the wagon, but said he'd have to drive right on to the village, just like that, with no excuse other than a careless glance at his watch. No, he guessed he wouldn't have time this morning, he said. Betsy cast an imploring look up into Uncle Henry's face, but evidently he felt himself quite helpless too. Oh, if only Cousin Anne had come. She would have marched him into the schoolhouse double quick. But Uncle Henry was not Cousin Anne, and though Betsy saw him as they drove away, conscientiously point out little Elias, resplendent and shining. Mr. Pond only nodded absently, as though he were thinking of something else. Betsy could have cried with disappointment, but she and the other girls, putting their heads together for comfort, told each other that there was time enough yet. Mr. Pond would not leave town till tomorrow. Perhaps there was still some hope. But that afternoon, even this last hope was dashed. As they gathered at the schoolhouse, the girls fresh and crisp in the newly starched dresses with red or blue hair ribbons, the boys very self-conscious in their dark suits, clean collars, new caps, all but Ralph, and black shoes. There was no little Elias. They waited and waited, but there was no sign of him. Finally, Uncle Henry, who was to drive the straw ride down to town, looked at his watch, gathered up the reins, and said they would be late if they didn't start right away. Maybe Elias had a chance to ride in with somebody else. They all piled in. The horses stepped off. The wheels grated on the stones. And just at that moment, a dismal sound of sobbing wails reached them from the woodshed back of the schoolhouse. The children tumbled out as fast as they had tumbled in and ran back, Betsy and Ralph at their head. There, in the woodshed, was little Elias, huddled in the corner behind some wood, crying and crying and crying, digging his fists into his eyes, his face all smeared with tears and dirt. He was dressed again in his filthy, torn old overalls and ragged shirt. His poor little bare feet shone with a piteous cleanliness in that dark place. "What's the matter? What's the matter?" the children asked him all at once. He flung himself on Ralph, burying his face in the other boy's coat, and sobbed out some disjointed story which only Ralph could hear. And then at last, and final climax of the disaster, who should come looking over the shoulders of the children but Uncle Henry and Mr. Pond. And Elias, all ragged and dirty again, Betsy sat down weakly on a pile of wood, utterly disheartened. What was the use of anything? "What's the matter?" asked the two men together. Ralph turned with an angry toss of his dark head and told them bitterly over the heads of the children. "He just had some decent clothes. First ones he's ever had. And he was lotting on going to the exercises in the town hall. And that darned old skunk of a stepfather has gone and taken him and sold him to get whiskey. I'd like to kill him." Betsy could have flung her arms around Ralph. He looked so exactly the way she felt. "Yes, he is a darned old skunk," she said to herself, rejoicing in the bad words she did not know before. It took bad words to qualify what had happened. She saw an electric spark pass from Ralph's blazing eyes to Mr. Pond's broad face, now grim and fierce. She saw Mr. Pond step forward, brushing the children out of his way like a giant among dwarfs. She saw him stoop and pick little Elias up in his great strong arms and, holding him close, stride furiously out of the woodshed, across the playground to the buggy which was waiting for him. "He'll go to the exercises all right," he called back over his shoulder in a great roar. "He'll go if I have to buy out the whole town to get him an outfit. And that whelp won't get these clothes either. You hear me say so." He sprang into the buggy and, holding Elias on his lap, took the reins and drove rapidly forward. they saw little Elias again entering the town hall, holding fast to Mr. Pond's hand. He was magnificent in a whole suit of store clothes, coat and all, and he wore white stockings and neat low shoes like a city child. They saw him later up on the platform, squeaking out his little patriotic poem, his eyes shining like stars, fixed on one broad, smiling face in the audience. When he finished, he was overcome with shyness by the applause, and for a moment forgot to turn and leave the platform. He hung his head, and looking out from under his eyebrows, gave a quaint, shy little smile at the audience. Betsy saw Mr. Pond's great smile waver and grow dim. His eyes filled so full that he had to take out his handkerchief and blow his nose loudly. And they saw little Elias once more for the last time. Mr. Pond's buggy drove rapidly past their slow-moving hay wagon, Mr. Pond holding the reins masterfully in one hand. Beside him, very close, sat Elias with his lap full of toys. Oh, full, like Christmas. In that fleeting glimpse, they saw a toy train, a stuffed dog, a candy box, a pile of picture books, tops, paper bags, and even the swinging crane of the big mechanical toy dredge that everybody said the storekeeper could never sell to anybody because it cost so much. As they passed swiftly, Elias looked out at them and waved his little hand flutteringly. His other hand was tightly clasped in Mr. Pond's big one. He was smiling at them all. His eyes looked dazed and radiant. He turned his head as the buggy flashed by to call out in a shrill, exulting little shout, "Goodbye, goodbye, I'm going to live with..." And they could hear no more. He was gone. Only his little hand still waving at them over the back of the buggy seat. Betsy drew a long, long breath. She found that Ralph was looking at her. For a moment, she couldn't think what made him look so different. Then she saw that he was smiling. She had never seen him smile before. He smiled at her as though he was sure she would understand, and never said a word. Betsy looked forward again and saw the gleaming buggy vanishing over the hill in front of them. She smiled back at Ralph silently. Not a thing had happened the way she had planned. No, not a single thing. But it seemed to her she had never been so happy in her life.